The Gnostic Gospel of Thomas has followed a strange, circuitous route through history. There were many, many Gnostic Gospels that were written, many Gospels that fell outside the canon of, or what later became the canon, that were written in the early centuries of the Christian church. And they all said very different things, very different ideas of who Jesus was and who God was and what humanity is. Most of them were suppressed, and most of them were, the church at the time said, find them and destroy them. And what we learned about them and knew about them for a very long time was what was written down by one of the bishops at the time, and his name was Irenaeus, and he wrote a book disputing the doctrines that were found in those Gospels. And one of the Gospels that was named there that he was arguing with was the Gospel of Thomas, but we didn't have access to that Gospel. But one of the things that he named as he was disputing it and arguing with it was that the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas had this notion that there is this fragment of divinity, this fragment of God, this fragment of radical goodness that is inside of all people, and that we all have access to that. It was very different from, say, John's gospel, which states that Jesus is the Logos, Jesus is the one and only carrier of that kernel of God in history. The Gospel of Thomas stated that we all have that inside of us. And so it followed the circuitous route through history. It was picked up in the 1850s, and this is again just based upon the reference that Irenaeus had written down at that point, disputing it. But it was picked up by Leo Tolstoy, who wrote a book called The Kingdom is Within. And he argued that we have this capacity for radical goodness inside of us, and that we can live in a way that is nonviolent and kind and generous with one another. It was then picked up in the middle of the 20th century by Thomas Merton, the famous Trappist monk who wrote many spiritual writings, and he had a very mystical understanding of it, that it was the connection with our source of all creation, but also this intrinsic goodness that we all have access to and a connection with. And then it was about the same time that Thomas Merton was writing that a whole library of the Gnostic Gospels was discovered. This is the Nag Hammadi library, and the Gospel of Thomas was in there. And so that's where we get the reading that Carla offered to us today, where Jesus is in fact saying in that gospel, according to that gospel, we don't know whether it's historical or not. That's not important for what we're talking about today, but not historical in the sense of that Jesus actually said it. We don't know, but this understanding of Jesus, that he's in fact telling us that we each have this kernel of radical goodness inside of us, and that the kingdom is not up in the heavens, it's not outside of us, it's within us, it's within our hearts. There's something profound and powerful about that, I think. I'm going to shift gears a bit, because this week, what I have been doing, how I have been spending a lot of my time, a lot of my days, is I've been over at the Highland Park High School, and I have been sitting at the table with some of my other interfaith colleagues, and we've been offering spiritual care to anyone who would like to come up and have a conversation. The rabbis on the table even had a little sign that said, like, ask a rabbi. I love that. It reminds me of the Peanuts, the Peanuts thing, which is like advice, like 5 cents or something like that. Yeah, 5 cents, right. I'm really grateful that opportunity was set up, because I was able to talk with a number of folks who had very different things to say. Many of those things were heavy and they were about the emotional experience that they were carrying since the shooting at the Highland Park parade. And then at the same time, many had questions. And I think that this is often true, that our theological questioning is often interwoven with the depths of our emotional experiences. When we experience something deep and profound, we're also asking the bigger questions at the same time. And so many people were asking questions about where was God in the midst of all of this. And there were other people who, didn't have a conception of God and were still asking about what is the meaning, what is the context, how can we come to some understanding about what we saw happen at the parade. And one of the most frequent questions, a question that came up again and again, was this question of evil. What are we to make of evil in the world? Was this evil? How can we understand evil? And so I'd like to talk a little bit about evil today, because I think that situations like these, when we see this needless slaughter of innocent people, what are we to make of that? What are we to make of that act? How are we to understand it? How are we to conceptualize it? How are we to language it? Should we call it evil? Evil is a concept that has a metaphysical hangover, I would say, and it's a pretty deep one. I grew up Unitarian Universalist. However, I went to a Missouri Synod Lutheran grade school, and I won't get into why I ended up there. That's a different story. But they had a very developed idea of evil, and it was very metaphysical. It was the concept of the devil, kind of slipping around and sort of pulling puppeteering strings on human beings, and that's what, would cause folks to behave in evil ways. But what I have come to appreciate is the way that many philosophers talk about evil. And they talk about it in a way that is not grounded in that sort of metaphysical understanding, but rather they talk about it as a particular disposition of character. And what they're getting at there is that some people cultivate or have cultivated in them a disposition to do extreme harm to other people. And there's nothing metaphysical underneath that. It's not based on something demonic or satanic or anything like that. It is instead an observation that some people have that nurtured inside of themselves such that they act in that particular way in the world. Now, what many of these philosophers will say is that you can distinguish between what they call thin and thick descriptions of evil or of evil character. And what they mean by this is that a thick description of an evil character, of someone who has developed an evil character, is someone who inflicts harm for the sake of inflicting harm. They inflict harm because they want to see the ravage and the destruction that happens as a result of it. And there's a certain even enjoyment that they derive from inflicting that kind of harm in the world. A thin description of evil, they would say, is one where someone is willing to inflict extreme harm, but it's for a different purpose. Hannah Arendt famously talked about the banality of evil. And what she was getting at in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, was a notion that many of the people who were Nazi bureaucrats did not have this sadistic streak in them where they wanted to see suffering to other people. Instead, they were doing it, as Eichmann himself articulated, they were doing it They were inflicting this harm on other people because of other goals that they had for their lives, including career advancement, enriching themselves, going up higher in the bureaucratic structure. Hannah Arendt has a very powerful part of that book, and it's one that it continues to resonate for me. She says at the end of it, she says, at the end of the day, we don't care why you did it. We don't care why you did it. We care that you did it. And I think that that allows us not to become lost in some of the excuses that people will develop around understanding evil, in terms of, well, I did it because of X, Y, and Z. I did it because my dog ate my homework. No. We care that you did it. We care that you behaved in that particular way. So another controversy in philosophical understandings of evil has to do with whether we should even attempt to understand evil. And there's a really interesting literature around this, a really interesting conceptualization around this. There is a certain fear that if we try to understand how evil flourishes in the world, or understand what evil is, we end up building a bridge towards it, and we end up domesticating it in a way that it shouldn't be. These philosophers and theologians will say that evil is fundamentally something that should be incomprehensible to us. It should be incomprehensible to us that some people perpetuate genocide. We shouldn't be able to understand how to get there, how we get there. And I think that there's something to maintain about that evil does have this radical quality that should not be explained away, that we shouldn't be able to understand fully how someone got there. If we maintain a certain horror and distance around evil acts, that might in fact prevent us and prevent our communities from fully going there. But I also appreciate this other branch of philosophers who talk about this and the way they articulate it, where they will talk about how we may not ever, and we probably should never be able to fully understand evil. And at the same time, we should understand that there are certain circumstances that are highly amenable to evil and other ones that really discourage it, such that we are then able to understand how we can prevent it in the world. And so we might think about how someone who lacks resources for mental health, or resources for their emotional well-being, or families that have complicated dynamics, how when those are left untended and the people in those situations don't have the resources to grapple with what's happening, it's going to be more likely to produce a deformed character, to produce an evil character. Does it necessarily? No. And this is another thing that philosophers write about in terms of evil. We can understand everything about a person and everything about why they behaved in the particular way that they did. Everything about the family dynamics, everything about the ideology that they became attached to, everything about the problematic communities that encouraged them to behave in a particular way. And it will never fully answer the question of why they behaved in the way that they did. Philosophers refer to this as the black hole that is at the center of conceptions of evil. There's a fundamental thing that we're never going to be able to fully grasp, because we can name many people who had equally tragic circumstances growing up, equally problematic communities that they were a part of, and yet chose not to act in that particular way. Nonetheless, understanding the circumstances that allows someone to move in the direction of committing the acts that they did, our understanding of that may allow us to seek to prevent it from happening again. I bring all of this up because I have been following, as many of us have, the story of Robert Cremo III and what it was that led him to do what he did. And what we can discover in that story is that there was a problematic home life. There were opportunities that were missed for intervention. There were clearly issues that were present for him. There's also online forums that he was a part of that nurtured violent and destructive behavior. There are so many corners on the internet that are highly problematic and disturbing. And none of those things fully explain why he did what he did. At the same time, trying to come to a deeper grasp of why his character became deformed in such a way that he was not only willing, but enthusiastic about inflicting the harm that he did, may help us to adjust those circumstances so that people aren't in those circumstances in the future, and maybe it'll prevent some of that from happening. I began today with the Gospel of Thomas. And the Gospel of Thomas is not about evil. It's about the kingdom. It's about the kingdom being within. It's about this radical fragment of light, of divinity, of God that is inside each person. That's how Jesus articulates it in there. And even if we don't use that kind of theological language, it's that notion of this bright, shining, sparkling center of goodness that we can access. And just as I articulated that there is this lacuna, this black hole inside of an evil character that prevents us from ever fully understanding what allows an evil character to develop, there is also a sparkling goodness, a center to good and kind and generous acts that we can never fully understand or comprehend or try to domesticate, and instead we just accept it, and we just have to lean into it. I think about some of the heroes who after the shooting at the parade, they were ones who rushed in to help. There was a story that came out last week about this person who was crouched down, and she was trying to shield herself and protect herself from the bullets. And this man rushed past and said, "I need you to take my 2.5-year-old. I need you to take my 2-year-old in order to protect her." And she didn't even know why he was asking that. She took that 2-year-old and then laid on top of the 2-year-old and just kept saying, "It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay," even knowing that by doing that, she was stretching her body out in a way that exposed her to harm. And just as we can say with that black hole in the center of evil that we can never fully comprehend, that we can never fully comprehend why someone does evil in the world, when someone behaves in a courageous way like that, in a way that is fundamentally good and beautiful, we can name all of the things that set them up to behave in a courageous way. We can name all of the things that set them up to be kind and generous people. And there will still be this bright, sparkling center that we are never able to fully grasp or comprehend. The invitation is to hold on to that center, to name it, to hold it, and to lean into it. Because while I do believe that each of us are capable of evil, each of us are also capable of a radical goodness. Each of us are capable of leaning into a goodness that sparkles and is brighter than anything else that we see in this world. Let us hold on to that.